I'm Priscilla Barrera with the Investing News Network, and here with me today is Stephen Riddle, CEO of Asbury Carbons. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
All right. So we're in day one of the Graphite and Anodes conference here in Newport Beach, and we're well in the last quarter of the year. Can you let our audience briefly know what were the main trends you've seen in the graphite market this year?
I'm going to break it into two types. I'm going to break it into the natural flake graphite, which is also used in the battery market. In the case of that, we've seen a lot of new capacity come on stream outside of China in the mining industry. And so knowing that, the issue that the natural flake is going to start running into is capacity is greater than the demand growth. But on the other hand, we got synthetic graphite, which also goes into battery anode manufacture. And there, one of the unique precursors that the industry like is what we call needle petroleum coke, needle-based coke. And that material is very short in supply. It is oversold. And to build new capacity for that, for needle coke, we're at least 5 years out. So there we're going to see a limitation of what is going to be available in this, using that as a precursor. So the synthetic side of the industry is going to have to come up with other precursors that they can use to make good quality synthetic battery anode graphite.
And in your opinion, is today's graphite market a seller's market or a buyer's market?
In the case of natural flake, it is turning into a buyer's market. With overcapacity, a buyer has the ability to play one supplier off against the other, and we're starting to see prices come down. On the opposite side, the synthetic graphite, that is more of a seller's market because supply of the precursor is limited and the demand by the battery industry continues to grow.
And what would be your best piece of advice for an investor who's looking to jump into the graphite market?
Well, let's talk about both of them. So first you have the natural flake graphite side of the market, where you would start out developing a graphite mine. We have out there currently close to 300 to 400 junior mining companies that have found graphite deposits around the world. So the good news is there's enough graphite in the Earth's crust to take care of the next 200 years of any demand. The difficulty is of those 300 to 400 junior miners, which ones are going to make it? Because we don't need that much graphite today, and it's going to be, even as the battery market grows, it will be a long time before we need to develop that many new graphite mines. So it's finding the right graphite junior miner that you feel meets the criteria of being low cost, of having a good business plan that's realistic in the market that I would recommend you for investing. On the other hand, the synthetic graphite, that tends to be private companies in China or big companies like Hitachi in Japan that are public companies already. So that's today there really hasn't been a lot of investment of companies on their own in that. So again, if you can find somebody that's come up with a way to make a new type of synthetic anode material that will be public, there's potentially a good opportunity.
And in graphite mining, how does the capital expenditure compare to other minerals or other metals?
In the natural graphite space, this is one of the issues of why I believe we have overcapacity, is the capex is very low compared to other minerals. And really, there's a big difference between the capex of privately owned graphite mining companies and publicly owned graphite mining companies. I mean, I've seen differences in capex for the same capacity as the private can build the same size capacity graphite mine for about 1/3 the cost of a public company. And so that's what's going to make it difficult for the graphite industry to see any price increases, because I believe that with low capexes, investors tend to think that the risks are lower. And when they think the risks are lower, they invest in new capacity faster than demand growth. On the other side, the synthetic, it is a much more capital-intensive process to develop a synthetic graphite. It's a lot more R&D up front. So there you wouldn't tend to see as much overcapacity. But it's a much more riskier business to find the right type of synthetic that the industry can use.
All right. And do you think investors think because the capex for new graphite mines are low that the risks are also low?
Definitely. Right now the graphite industry is experiencing where we added a fair amount of capacity in the last 2 years, both private and public. And so now the money temporarily has kind of dried up because we've added so much capacity, and particularly we've added it with one public company, Sarah in Mozambique, whose capacity is estimated to be 360,000 tons. So the industry from the investment banks situation is they're putting their money on hold. They're giving money to junior miners to keep working on their business plans, but for the big capex to build a mine, they're kind of waiting and seeing. And we'll have to wait and see how well they do about giving a fair return to their investors, especially when we are experiencing overcapacity.
All right. And how easy is it for new graphite mines to sell out their capacity? And what would you say is a realistic average FOB mine selling price?
This can get very complicated. First thing is the average selling price is first based on the footprint or the size of flakes that the mine will produce and the purity of the flakes that the mine will produce. So there are typically in the industry 3 different size flakes we call jumbo, or some people will call it plus 50 mesh. We'll call medium flake or plus 80 mesh, and we'll call fine flake, which is typically minus 80 mesh or minus 100 mesh. So the finer the particle size, the average cost for the same purity is lower. The larger the particle size, the average cost is higher. So each mine, depending on how their flake size and their purity plays out, could have a different average selling price. The second thing you got to look at, if you're looking at it as an investor, is how much capacity are they adding of the various flake sizes and purity levels. Because you really have to determine what is the market share for that particular flake size and purity range. So let's say I have a mine, hypothetically, that produces a lot of jumbo flake, real large plus 50. Let's say it's 70% jumbo flake. And I want to build a capacity of 50,000 tons. Well, now I'm adding close to 40,000 tons of new capacity of that jumbo flake. And if you look at the total world market for just that jumbo flake, I've just increased the capacity on the world market by probably 100%. So how realistic is it going to be for me to sell out most of that capacity? I have to put all the competitors that sell plus 50 out of business. So this is where it gets so complicated in the graphite, because you really have to break down the deposit to determine what is realistic. And nobody that I've seen really takes the time to understand that or do that. And so it is much more difficult to sell flake graphite than people think. It's not like selling a metal lithium where you have if you meet certain purity level, it just kind of sells itself. Graphite, you have to go out to individual customers, you got to get approval, you got to work to sell it by the container lot.
One of the big topics here is the changing technology in batteries. What is, in your opinion, the long-term future, maybe 10 to 20 years out, for natural graphite used to make battery anodes? What is your take? Will battery anodes of the future use less or no graphite, or?
We don't really know at this point. I mean, there were some very good talks this morning at the conference discussing that, and people that live in that industry, in the anode industry, and they're not sure. They do know that they need to try to make a more dense anode material. And so in order to make a more dense anode material, it means they're going to use less graphite or they're not going to use graphite at all. That could happen. But it's really still too early to tell where the industry is going to play out 10 or 20 years from now.
All right, Stephen, my last question for you then. In the short term, what do you expect for the graphite market in 2019? more of the same for graphite, a better market, a worse market?
Well, the good news is we expect growth, okay? Even the steel industry is growing, so even traditional industries are growing at a small rate, 2 or 3% per year. And obviously, the battery industry is growing much faster than that. And the battery industry today is the number 2 consumer of graphite. The refractory still remains the number 1 consumer of graphite. So in the graphite anode market, we expect even greater growth. But in the case of natural graphite, the capacity that we've added in the last few years is easily available to supply that growth. So I project that prices will decrease or at least remain flat, that we will not see any increases in the natural graphite. On the other hand, the synthetic graphite, which a lot of the battery people prefer to use a higher percentage of synthetic, because it's what I like to call engineered graphite. The properties are more controlled. There we're going to have a problem at some point very shortly because the precursor needle coke that I talked about before is in limited supply. And so the industry's got to come up with some other alternative precursors to make synthetic graphite, or else they will be forced to switch to more natural graphite.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome, and thanks for having me.